everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director for the Iran program at the FDD. Behnam, thank you so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure. Great to be with you, Brittany.
New details have emerged regarding a potential nuclear deal between the United States and Iran, and I would love to pick your brain about the details. The White House called it a, quote, very detailed and acceptable proposal, but multiple reports say that the plan allows low levels of uranium enrichment for a certain amount of time that has yet to be determined. So, to start off the conversation, what are your takeaways to what we know so far about the potential agreement?
Well, the most important takeaway is that this is a fast evolving political drama that is kaleidoscopic. Because what we know about the contours of a deal, whether it's leaks through the American side, the Iranian side, or anyone else in the press, are really just snapshots of a much larger, much faster moving video of these multiple rounds of direct or indirect negotiations. For instance, there was a headline just recently that said that the US was willing to permit, based on these proposals, low level enrichment in Iran. But the president of the United States came out on social media hours after that saying absolutely the exact opposite thing, which was that the US was not going to be granting Iran domestic enrichment. So there are more questions than answers at this point, but there's at least two popularly floated elements that have been reported from the American offer. One of which includes having a multinational enrichment facility off of Iranian soil, and then where the Iranians would contribute, and it would benefit other countries looking for civil nuclear power in the region. I still have some concerns about that. And then the other one, of course, would be that the Iranians might pause all of their national enrichment and kind of quote unquote re earn it back at a later date. I think there are still more problems than solutions with both of those approaches, but nonetheless, it's quite clear in my mind that the White House is looking for technical solutions to a much larger political problem.
Talk about that. If you have some problems with this, some concerns about the snapshot of this proposal we're seeing, what are they?
Well, if we take the first popularly floated element of this proposal, which is a multinational enrichment facility, it might sound good on paper. It might sound like a clever technical solution to a political problem. But we have to remember that personnel who work in a multinational enrichment facility will have access to the full fuel cycle. And this is precisely how you had the AQ Khan network on steroids. You had a person, AQ Khan, at a enrichment facility in Europe, and then be able to take back that technology, take back those blueprints, and really share it with engineers and anyone who would really be willing to purchase that. So the question here is, if this is a proliferation solution, we should remember that in the past there have been proliferation problems with this, and it would depend a great deal on who else is a partner and where this facility is located. For instance, if it's located just near Iranian territory, and if countries like, for example, Saudi Arabia are joining, well, then would they have access to this capability in the future? It creates more questions than answers on the safeguard side and the future nuclear hedging side, in my view. But nonetheless, again, it's a sign that the US is technically thinking through a very complex political problem.
I want to talk about one of the larger headlines that came out of this deal that President Trump seemingly responded to on social media. Axios and other outlets reported that the proposal allows low levels of uranium enrichment for a certain amount of time on Iranian soil. President Trump refuted that. He said this, quote, under our potential agreement, we will not allow any enrichment of uranium. What do you make of this back and forth and this contradiction?
Well, there's certain things one can make of it. If you do have a deal attained very quickly, given how far apart the public positions of the US and Iran are, it would be a sign that privately there have been very different, perhaps much less rigid conversations between the two, be it directly or indirectly. So if there is a deal that does come about quite quickly, it might mean that the tough public stance of both sides may not have been that tough, or at least one side would have caved. So that's one big picture thing to worry about. The second is, of course, that again, these stories are based on leaks, are based on information from one side. And again, it's like taking a snapshot of a much larger moving image. And while that might accurately capture something, we have to remember that accurately captures something in time. It would be really interesting to have the president and even multiple members of his administration come out so forcefully and defend something that they believe would be in a deal, and then ultimately give in on it last minute.
That's a really good point, and that seems to be the real point of contention in this deal because Iran said they aren't signing a deal that prohibits uranium enrichment. The U.S. publicly has said that's a non-starter, and Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy, said this last month, quote, "An enrichment program can never exist in the state of Iran ever again." He also added this, quote, "That's our red line, no enrichment. That means dismantlement. It means no weaponization." He also added that the three enrichment facilities have to be dismantled. So, do you think there is a world in which the US is that strong on that position and then they go back on that?
Believe it or not, it is costly, it is risky, but there is a world in that. That world cannot come about after two or three or four or even five rounds of nuclear talks between the Americans and the Iranians when the Iranians are still able to export over 1.5 million barrels of oil a day over a period of time when their partners, the Houthis in Yemen, for example, are still able to shoot ballistic missiles at US partners like Israel, for example. It cannot exist in that ecosystem. The Islamic Republic does back down. The Islamic Republic does back down when it's faced with strength, but it does most importantly take the choice to back down when it sees its options closing in. Take, for example, the fact that they're negotiating with Trump now. For all of the Trump term one administration and all of the Biden administration, the Iranians had denigrated President Trump and said they would never talk to him. They dismissed all of his public and private envoys. They even mocked his social media outreach to him. But now here they find themselves talking to him because they understand the weak hand they have in 2025. So what was a red line in the past might be a pink line in the present or in the future. The same, of course, for uranium enrichment. There was a Reuters story recently based on an exclusive finding that said that allegedly the Iranians were considering a pause in all of their uranium enrichment. Now, while I think a pause is not good enough, you need full dismantlement and an end to all enrichments. The fact that the Iranians are even entertaining a pause when they have not stopped enriching uranium for one single day since April 2006, outlasting four very different administrations, is more proof that some red lines can become pink. So if I had 2 seconds with the president, I would say, sir, keep pushing.
I want to talk about a different administration. That's the Obama administration, because Obama's Iran deal, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, President Trump was very critical of that. Now and he withdrew the United States during his first term. Now he's in his second term. He's negotiating an Iran deal. I know you're saying that this is just a snapshot in time, but how does this, based on what we know now, differ from Obama's Iran deal?
Well, hypothetically, if low level enrichment at the 3.6% level would be permitted to continue, even at one facility in Iran, or if we were going to be taking Iran's word about coming clean about some past weapons allegations, for example, or we would be replicating the very mistakes that President Trump critiqued the Obama administration for back when he was campaigning before his first term. Remember, President Trump spent about a year and a half trying to fix the Iran nuclear deal before leaving the Iran nuclear deal. And that failed fix reflected some of the areas that the US was critical. One example was ballistic missiles, for example. If this proposed framework, interim deal, what have you, does not address the most likely delivery vehicle for a potential Iranian nuclear weapon, which is, per the US intelligence, it would be by ballistic missile, then it would be an own goal. And then politically, the administration should be wary of that it can't agree to something worse, equal, or even less than it critiqued back in 2015. And similarly, they should be aware of what reputational consequences would exist for being able to deter Iran moving forward. Meaning, if the Iranians have the talking point that they got the guy who left the 2015 deal in 2018 back into the same deal or worse in 2025, then they might not take the rest of his threats or might not see the rest of his policy towards them as being credible. And this raises, again, more problems than solutions.
And Obama faced a lot of criticisms for that deal. Critics said that Iran got more out of the deal than the United States. It emboldened Iran. The money from the sanctions relief could be used to fund proxy terror groups, and it potentially gave Iran a leg up when it came to developing nuclear weapons. When you're looking at this framework for the Iran deal now, what do you think the United States' real goal is, and how close do you think it is to achieving that?
Again, if we are going to take these reported snapshots as hypothetically as a proxy for that larger video, as a proxy for that larger strategy, it would show that the US is putting stopping an Iranian nuclear weapon at the forefront of its entire policy towards Iran. But as it does that, it needs to be quite cognizant of the failures of previous administrations who also made that the altar on which they sacrificed the rest of not just Iran policy, but regional policy. One of the reasons that the Iranians had been trying to kill President Trump was that his presidency in term one was quite different. He was remarkably successful. He did unilateral max pressure, proving you didn't need the Europeans for that. He actually supported the Iranian people every time they were protesting, when the conventional wisdom in DC was that if you supported them, it would be the kiss of death. And then he was willing to pull the trigger against Iran's chief terrorist, Qasem Soleimani, and the sky didn't fall. So, in all of these areas, the president has really broken past the conventional wisdom. It would be a shame for him to re embrace that conventional wisdom and put handcuffs on his Iran policy and replicate the failures of past administrations.
To that point, then, how does this administration go about maneuvering those pitfalls? How do they say, hey, this is what a past administration did? That was not successful. That didn't work out. We have X, Y, and Z criticisms there. And how do they avoid that in these negotiations?
Well, there's a couple different ways. One is to make sure that you're seen entering talks with a credible hand. I understand the administration has its deconfliction agreement with the Houthis, but so long as the Houthis are still having the capability to threaten the U.S., including our assets, our forces, so long as maritime trade has not 100% snapped back to normal in the Red Sea, there is no straight line from failing to deter a proxy of the Islamic Republic to being able to deter, or best at the negotiating table, the Islamic Republic itself. So it helps to actually have an improved position to toughen your hand against the proxies of the Islamic Republic. Second is, of course, when you're at the negotiating table, don't be so eager. Taking a line from the president from The Art of the Deal, he says, never be afraid to walk away. I think the Islamic Republic has to be made to understand that it's the weaker position here. It's the supplicant, not the superpower, and that America doesn't necessarily need to stay at the table. Doesn't mean leaving the negotiations, but it means not expressing this continuous stream of optimism and urgency that we've seen in high-level U.S. Statements. For example, by March, by Persian New Year, which is in the springtime every year, the Iranian rial, the currency relative to the US dollar, was trading at 1 million, the historic low. Since the negotiations, the rial has actually appreciated relative to the dollar just because of the positive atmosphere brought to you by multiple rounds of negotiations and a steady stream of, in my view, with respect, overly positive US commentary. Pump the brakes on the commentary, make the Iranians feel the pain, and have them come to you.
I want to talk about some of that commentary. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said this, quote, Special Envoy Wickoff sent a very detailed and acceptable proposal to the Iranian regime that the president hopes they will accept, and if not, they will face grave consequences. In your view, what do those grave consequences look like?
Broadly throughout term two Trump administration, every time the president has contrasted not being able to get a deal or a good deal with respect to the Iranian nuclear program, the opposing policy option he has publicly put forward is military action. Now, that could be the US, it could be Israel, it could be the US and Israel. But it's worth noting that in the month of May, for example, when the president traveled to the Persian Gulf region and when he was giving a speech in Saudi Arabia, the option that he contrasted with a good deal was not a military strike, but really just a resumption of maximum pressure. So that did raise a little bit of alarm bells.
I do want to talk about how Israel factors in here because Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly wants to strike Iran's nuclear sites should the United States and Iran not come to an agreement when it comes to this nuclear plan. So, where does Israel come into this equation?
Well, it certainly comes in several ways, not just with respect to the negotiations, because obviously stopping a nuclear Iran is just as much of a priority for the United States as it is for Israel, which actually is in the region and is within range of Iranian medium range ballistic missiles, many of which can unfortunately carry a nuclear warhead. So it behooves the US to be seen as much more publicly coordinating with the Israelis. And actually, in some of these stories that we've seen from the spring of this year, where allegedly the administration is holding back an Israeli strike, it would behoove Washington to bring that logic into the bilateral discussions with the Iranians. The Iranians need to believe that all that stands between them and a crushing Israeli strike is President Trump, and that is how you can actually get some of the regime's red lines to be made pink. They need to understand that the only way they survive is through these negotiations.
So, to that point, then, we have seen multiple rounds of negotiations between Iran and the United States. Between now and if and when there is a potential agreement agreed upon, what are you looking out for next?
Well, I'm looking out for statements both from the Iranian side and American side about how confident they may feel. I'm looking out for more of these. We'll deal with what we have, which are basically these leaks to the press that basically give us a couple of different snapshots. And I'm also looking for a perhaps less studied but very important track, which is the status of the Europeans. The Europeans have been negotiating with the Iranians on the nuclear issue much longer than the Americans. They have a critical diplomatic tool that will expire this year, this October, called Snapback. I'm looking for the Americans to be seen as coordinating with the Europeans to keep that option on the table. And in the month of June, I'm looking at Vienna, where the IEA Board of Governors will convene, potentially having a tough resolution on Iranian nuclear escalation. And I'll be looking to see if the US and its European partners will be able to turn that resolution to their political advantage, both at the negotiating table for the Americans and also at the UN for the Europeans.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for, and as the situation develops, as talks continue, I hope you come back on and break them down with us. Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you so much. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you. A pleasure.